My name is David, 40 years old, a man who once believed he had it all. I was born and raised in Austin, Texas, a city that's been booming with opportunity and growth. I started my career as a software engineer at a big tech company. The job was stable, the salary was good, but deep down, I knew I wanted more. I craved the freedom to build something of my own, something that wasn't tied to someone else's vision. My startup, Next Tech Solutions, began as a small project in my garage. You know, the kind of story tech guys in Silicon Valley love to tell. But this wasn't California, this was Texas, and the challenges were different. There were countless sleepless nights, months surviving on instant noodles and coffee, but slowly, I built the first version of my software platform. And when it started generating revenue, I knew I was on the right path. At that point, I felt like the luckiest man alive. Not just because my business was finally taking off, but because I had Amanda by my side. Amanda wasn't just my wife, she was the woman I trusted with everything. She was a brilliant lawyer working at one of the top advertising firms in the city. We met for the first time at my sister Katie's graduation party. I remember the moment clearly, one look at her, and I was hooked by her confidence and sharp wit. Our first date is still vivid in my memory. It was a windy Friday evening, and I took Amanda to this cozy little bar hidden in the historic district of Austin. We talked about everything, books, ambitions, life dreams. Amanda had a smile that could light up the room, and when she looked at me, I felt like the most important man in the world. That night, I thought to myself, this is the woman I want to spend my life with. Just a few months later, we got married. It was a small, intimate ceremony with only family and close friends. Amanda and I moved into the old house I inherited from my grandparents, a place filled with memories and a sense of history. Our early days of marriage felt like a dream. Amanda was always there for me, supporting me in every decision, cheering me on even when things got tough. Together, we painted a picture of a future with kids and a peaceful life in the suburbs. But life, as it often does, took an unexpected turn. As Amanda climbed higher in her career, I started to notice subtle changes in her. Maybe it was something I didn't want to admit to myself, a shift I tried to ignore, chalking it up to work stress. But in reality, this was the beginning of a fracture, one that started the moment she entered a world full of powerful, ambitious people I barely knew. Yet, I continued believing that I was living a fairy tale, completely oblivious to the dark storm brewing beneath the surface. Little did I know, this was just the start of a tragic story that would unravel everything I once held dear. Amanda and I first met on a warm May evening at my sister Katie's graduation party. It was an outdoor event at a small restaurant by the lake. I remember the golden sunset reflecting off the water, lanterns hanging overhead, casting a soft glow across the place. I was chatting with some friends when I noticed her, a striking woman who stood out from the crowd. She wore a deep blue dress, her chestnut hair shimmering in the light, and that smile, a smile that made the entire world feel like it slowed down for a second. Katie introduced us, saying, "This is David, my brother," and then turning to Amanda, "And this is Amanda, my colleague from the law firm." The moment we shook hands, I knew I was hooked. Amanda wasn't just beautiful, she exuded confidence. She spoke with an intelligence and charm that immediately made me feel a connection I hadn't felt in a long time. After that night, we started dating. We'd spend our evenings walking along the Colorado River, sharing quiet moments over coffee at a small cafe on South Converse Avenue. Everything felt easy and natural. We didn't need to say much, just being together was enough. Amanda shared her dreams of climbing the ranks in the legal world, aspiring to become one of the top lawyers in the city. Meanwhile, I opened up about my vision for starting my own tech company, my desire to build something meaningful from scratch. We got married just a few months after we started dating. It was a small, intimate wedding held at an old church in the outskirts of Austin. Amanda looked stunning in her white dress, and as she walked down the aisle, I couldn't believe that this incredible woman was about to become my wife. It was one of those moments where everything felt perfect, like life couldn't possibly get any better. The early days of our marriage were wonderful. We moved into the old house I inherited from my grandparents, a place filled with memories from my childhood. Every morning, I'd wake up next to Amanda and feel like the luckiest man in the world. Amanda was always the shining star, confident and intelligent. She was ambitious, but she also had a kind heart. She often volunteered her time with local nonprofits, supporting causes she believed in. I took pride in telling everyone about my wife, about the family we were building together. We'd spend late nights talking about the future, dreaming of kids running around the backyard, of a peaceful life in the suburbs far from the hustle and bustle of the city. But then, things started to shift when Amanda began climbing the career ladder faster than we had expected. She was promoted to partner at the law firm, a huge achievement not many could reach. At first, I was incredibly proud of her, but soon, I noticed Amanda was spending more and more time at work. Late-night meetings, frequent business trips, they became the new normal. Slowly, I began to feel a distance growing between us. Still, I kept telling myself it was only temporary, that we'd get through this phase. Looking back now, I realize those were the first cracks in our relationship, signs I chose to ignore. For years, I'd been working as a software engineer at a well-established tech company in downtown Austin. It was a good job with a steady paycheck, and on the surface, it seemed like everything was fine. But over time, the daily grind of corporate life started to wear on me. The routine meetings, the endless lines of code for projects I didn't care about, the layers of bureaucracy, it all became mind-numbing. I realized I was no longer passionate about what I was doing, I was just going through the motions. One night, after a particularly exhausting day at work, I came home and had a moment of clarity. I knew I needed to make a change. I'd been toying with the idea of starting my own company for years, but it always felt like a distant dream, something I'd do someday. Well, I decided that someday had arrived. I made up my mind to quit my job and take the leap into entrepreneurship. When I told Amanda about my decision, she didn't react the way I had hoped. I expected her to be excited, maybe even a little proud that I was finally following my dreams. Instead, she looked concerned, almost worried. "David, are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice full of hesitation. "You're giving up a stable income. We have a mortgage, bills to pay. What if it doesn't work out?" I understood her concerns, she had every right to be cautious. But I also felt a pang of disappointment. I wanted her support, her confidence in me, and it hurt that she couldn't see the potential I saw. I brushed off her worries, convincing myself that she was just being overly cautious. "I know it's a risk, but I believe in this," I told her. "I've got a great idea for a software platform. It's going to change the way small businesses manage their operations. Trust me on this." I plunged headfirst into building my startup, Next Tech Solutions. I set up a makeshift office in our garage and spent every waking hour coding, researching, and sketching out business plans. It felt invigorating, like I was finally doing something that mattered to me. I was filled with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. But as I threw myself deeper into my work, I started to notice something unsettling. The more time I spent on the business, the more distant Amanda seemed. She was working long hours too, often coming home late from the office, exhausted and irritable. Our dinners together became shorter, our conversations more strained. I'd try to tell her about the progress I was making, the new features I was developing, but she didn't seem interested. "That's great, David," she'd say, distracted, barely looking up from her phone. It was like we were living in two separate worlds, each caught up in our own ambitions. I wanted to believe that it was just a rough patch, that once the business took off, things would get better between us. But deep down, I could feel the rift widening. It wasn't just about the work anymore. It was something deeper, a disconnection that I couldn't quite put into words. The more I tried to ignore it, the more obvious it became. We were drifting apart, and I couldn't help but wonder if we were both too focused on our own dreams to notice that we were losing each other in the process. It was a Sunday morning, one of those rare days when both Amanda and I were at home together without any pressing work commitments. We were sitting at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and enjoying the quiet of the moment. Out of nowhere, Amanda put her mug down, took a deep breath, and looked me straight in the eyes. "David," she said softly, "I have some news. I'm pregnant." For a moment, I was stunned into silence. Then, as her words sank in, a wave of shock and disbelief washed over me. "Pregnant?" I repeated, as if I needed to say it out loud to believe it. Amanda nodded, her eyes wide with excitement. "And it's twins," she added, her voice filled with a kind of happiness I hadn't seen in a long time. This should have been a moment of pure joy, the kind of life-changing news every couple dreams of. But instead of elation, I felt something unexpected, an icy chill of doubt creeping up my spine. I tried to mask my reaction, forcing a smile. "That's incredible," I managed to say, wrapping my arms around her in what I hoped was a convincing embrace. But inside, my mind was racing. The timing felt off, like a jigsaw piece that didn't quite fit into the puzzle. I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Over the next few days, the doubts gnawed at me, refusing to go away. I kept replaying the timeline in my head, trying to make sense of it. Just a few weeks earlier, Amanda had been on a long business trip to Miami, a trip that was extended at the last minute. She'd been gone for almost 2 weeks, meeting with high-profile clients, including Jackson, her boss. I remember how she seemed different when she got back, more distant, almost guarded. I'd chalked it up to stress from work, but now I wasn't so sure. I knew it was irrational, maybe even unfair, but I couldn't help myself. I went to Amanda's calendar and checked the dates. The trip to Miami lined up perfectly with the time she would have conceived. I stood there, staring at the screen, feeling my heart sink. A part of me wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, that I was letting my insecurities get the better of me. But another part, the part one couldn't ignore, was screaming that there was more to this than Amanda was telling me. I tried to push the doubts aside, telling myself I was being paranoid. After all, this was Amanda, the woman I loved, the woman I had built a life with. But every time I looked at her, the questions lingered, unspoken and heavy. Why hadn't she told me about the pregnancy sooner? Why did it feel like she was hiding something? That night, as we lay in bed, Amanda drifted off to sleep almost immediately. I watched her, the way her chest rose and fell in the soft light of the room. She looked peaceful, content. And yet, I felt a chasm opening up between us, a dark void filled with uncertainty and fear. I wanted to reach out, to pull her close and share in the joy of this new chapter in our lives. But instead, I lay there, wide awake, haunted by the possibility that the life growing inside her might not be mine. It was the first time I realized that doubt, once it's planted, can spread like a poison, tainting everything it touches. And as hard as I tried to bury it, that seed of suspicion had already taken root, deep in the pit of my stomach. The twins, a boy and a girl, arrived on a cold, rainy afternoon in November. I remember the moment they were born. Amanda was exhausted but glowing, her face lit up with a kind of joy I hadn't seen in months. The nurses placed the babies in our arms, and I felt an overwhelming rush of emotion. They were beautiful, tiny, perfect. I tried to convince myself that they looked like me, searching for any resemblance, any small detail that would quiet the doubts gnawing at my mind. But as the days went by, that nagging feeling only grew stronger. I knew what I had to do, even though the thought of it made me sick. It felt like a betrayal, but I couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. One afternoon, while Amanda was resting and the babies were asleep, I collected samples, a strand of hair, a quick swipe inside their tiny mouths. I told myself it was just to put my mind at ease, that once I had the results, I'd feel foolish for ever doubting Amanda. I sent the samples to a private lab, not telling a soul about what I'd done. The results came back a few days later. I opened the envelope with trembling hands, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. As I scanned the paper, the world seemed to tilt beneath me. 0% probability of paternity. Not just for one of them, for both. My vision blurred as I read the words over and over, hoping they'd somehow change. But they didn't. It was the most crushing moment of my life, a knife driven straight into my heart. I confronted Amanda that very night. I couldn't keep it inside for another second. I found her in the nursery, rocking one of the twins to sleep. My hands were shaking, and I could barely get the words out. "Amanda," I said, my voice raw, "I did a DNA test. They're not mine." "How could you?" She didn't look surprised. She didn't even look guilty. Instead, she sighed, almost as if she'd been expecting this moment. She gently put the baby down and turned to face me, her expression a mask of calm. "David," she began, her voice eerily steady, "I didn't think it would come to this, but yes. You're right. They're not your children." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "Who?" I managed to choke out, though deep down, I already knew the answer. She met my gaze, unflinching. "Jackson," she said simply. "It's Jackson. Jackson. Her boss. The powerful, ambitious executive she'd been working for, the man she'd always spoken about with a mix of admiration and frustration. It all clicked into place, the late nights, the business trips, the distance that had grown between us. My hands clenched into fists, and I struggled to keep my voice from breaking. "How long?" I asked, feeling a tidal wave of betrayal crash over me. "For almost a year," she admitted. Her voice was calm, emotionless, like she was discussing a business deal. There wasn't a hint of remorse. "It wasn't supposed to turn out like this, David. I didn't plan for this to happen, but it did. And now, there's something you need to know." She pulled out an envelope from her purse and handed it to me. Inside was a letter from Jackson's legal team. It was an offer, a settlement. $2 million, on the condition that I sign away my parental rights and disappear from their lives. The arrogance of it, the audacity, made my blood boil. "He thinks he can buy me off?" I spat out, tearing the letter in half. "He thinks I'd sell my family for money?" Amanda's face hardened. "David, be realistic," she said, her voice suddenly sharp. "This is the best option for everyone. You'll get financial security, and Jackson will take care of the twins. It's what's best for them." In that moment, I felt a surge of rage unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just about the betrayal. It was the sheer callousness of it all, the way Amanda stood there, cool and detached, as if she were discussing a simple business transaction. She had ripped apart our family, destroyed the life we had built together, and now she wanted me to quietly step aside. I stared at her, barely recognizing the woman I had once loved. "No," I said, my voice shaking with fury. "I won't sign. I won't let you or Jackson dictate what happens next. You think you can just erase me like I never existed? This isn't over, Amanda. Not by a long shot." She didn't respond. She just stood there, watching me with that same unreadable expression, as if she couldn't quite comprehend why I wasn't going along with the plan. And in that moment, I knew, this wasn't just a betrayal of our marriage. It was a declaration of war. I rejected the offer outright, without a second thought. It wasn't just about my pride, though that was a big part of it. It was about something deeper, something primal. I had already lost so much: my trust in Amanda, the future I thought we were building together, and the very foundation of my life. I wasn't about to lose the last bit of control I had left. Refusing the money was the only way I could assert my power in this situation. I wanted them to know that I wouldn't be bought off, that I wouldn't simply disappear like an inconvenient mistake. I expected backlash, of course. But what happened next was beyond anything I could have imagined. It was a Wednesday night. The kind of night that's so quiet you can hear every creak of the old house, the wind rustling through the trees outside. I was alone, sitting at the kitchen table, staring blankly at my laptop. The screen glowed with spreadsheets and business emails, but I couldn't focus. My mind kept drifting back to the twins, to Amanda, to the rage I felt boiling inside me. I was on edge, but I had no idea just how dangerous things were about to get. The break-in happened so fast, it felt like a nightmare unfolding in real time. I heard the front door burst open with a deafening crash. Before I could even react, 3 men stormed into the kitchen. They were dressed in dark clothes, faces obscured by ski masks. For a split second, I was frozen in shock. Then, the first blow landed, a hard punch to the gut that knocked the wind out of me. I doubled over, gasping for breath, but they didn't stop. They kept coming at me, fists flying, boots slamming into my ribs. The pain was blinding, a white-hot explosion that sent me reeling to the floor. "Sign the papers," one of them growled, shoving a crumpled document into my face. It was the same legal waiver, the one Jackson's lawyers had sent, the one where I was supposed to give up my parental rights. I could barely make out the words through the blood dripping into my eyes. I tried to push the paper away, but they grabbed my hand, twisting my fingers until I thought they'd snap. "Do it," another one hissed, slamming my head against the cold tile floor. "Sign it, and this all ends." But I refused. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, but I managed to shake my head. It was a small gesture, but it was all I had left. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. Even as the blows rained down on me, even as I felt my consciousness slipping away, I clung to that defiance like a lifeline. Just before everything went dark, one of them leaned down, close enough that I could see his eyes through the mask, cold, calculating. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small syringe, and that's when I knew they weren't planning on leaving me conscious. As he knelt over me, I made a desperate grab, clawing at his sleeve. I managed to rip off a small piece of fabric, catching a few strands of hair that stuck to the sleeve's edge. It was a tiny, almost meaningless act, but it was all I could do in that moment. I shoved the fabric into my pocket just as the needle plunged into my arm. The world blurred, the pain fading into a distant, muffled roar. My vision narrowed, darkening at the edges. The last thing I remember before blacking out was the sound of their footsteps retreating, the door slamming shut behind them. And then, silence. When I came to, I was lying in a hospital bed. The harsh fluorescent lights burned my eyes, and every part of my body throbbed with pain. I tried to sit up, but a sharp agony shot through my ribs, and I collapsed back onto the pillow with a groan. That's when I noticed Nick standing by my bedside, his face a mix of anger and worry. "What happened?" he demanded, his voice low and tense. "Who did this to you?" I struggled to speak, my throat dry and raw. "It was Jackson's doing," I managed to croak out. "They tried to make me sign the papers. But I didn't." Nick's expression hardened, a dark resolve settling over his features. "You're lucky to be alive," he said, pulling up a chair. "But we're going to make them pay for this." As he spoke, I reached into the pocket of the tattered jeans I'd been wearing during the attack. My fingers brushed against the small scrap of fabric, the strands of hair I'd managed to grab. I pulled it out, showing it to Nick. His eyes widened as he realized what it was. "We have their DNA," I whispered, a grim smile spreading across my bruised lips. They didn't cover their tracks as well as they thought. In that moment, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in weeks, hope. It was fragile, but it was there. They had tried to break me, to scare me into submission. But instead, they had handed me the one piece of evidence I needed to fight back. And I wasn't going to waste it. Nick was there when I opened my eyes in the hospital, and he never left my side. He's been my best friend since college, the kind of friend who's more like a brother. We've been through everything together, late-night study sessions, wild road trips, and the ups and downs of building my startup. But I'd never seen him like this before. He was furious, pacing the hospital room, his face tight with barely contained rage. "David," he said when he saw me stir, his voice choked with relief and anger, "I thought I'd lost you, man. What the hell happened?" I couldn't respond right away, my ribs ached with every breath, and my mouth felt like it was filled with sand. But I didn't need to explain much. Nick had pieced it together. He knew about the DNA test, the confrontation with Amanda, and Jackson's thinly veiled threats. He'd been there when I refused the money, standing by me even when it meant going up against someone as powerful as Jackson. And now, he was here, ready to fight alongside me, even if it meant putting himself at risk. Nick's wife, Cam, was just as supportive. Cam had always been like a sister to me, a no-nonsense woman who didn't tolerate injustice. She was the one who handled the doctors, the police, and made sure the hospital staff treated me right. I remember her standing by my bed, her arms crossed, eyes narrowed with a fierce protectiveness. "We're going to get through this," she said, squeezing my hand. "And when we do, we're going to make them pay for what they've done." As I lay there, battered and bruised, I realized something important. I couldn't let this be the end of my story. I couldn't let Amanda, Jackson, and their cronies turn me into a victim. I had to fight back, not just for myself, but for the life they'd tried to steal from me. I needed help, someone who wasn't afraid to go toe-to-toe with powerful people. And I knew exactly who to call. Grace. Grace and I went way back. We'd met years ago, during a legal dispute involving one of my early tech projects. She was a sharp, relentless attorney with a reputation for taking on the cases no one else would touch. Grace had made her career standing up to corporate giants and corrupt executives. If there was anyone who could help me take down Amanda and Jackson, it was her. I called Grace from the hospital, my voice barely above a whisper. "Grace," I said, wincing as I shifted in bed, "I need your help. This is bigger than just a custody battle now. They tried to buy me off, and when I refused, they sent people to make sure I couldn't fight back." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Grace's voice came through, cool and confident. "Tell me everything," she said. I laid it all out for her, the affair, the DNA results, the attack, the settlement offer. By the time I finished, my throat was raw, and my hands were shaking, but I felt a strange sense of relief. I knew Grace wouldn't back down, no matter how messy this got. "We're not just going after Amanda and Jackson," she said firmly. "We're taking on the entire system that enabled this. The law firm, the advertising company, everyone who's complicit. They think they can use their power to bully you into submission. But they're about to find out they picked the wrong man to mess with." Over the next few weeks, as I recovered, we got to work. Grace came to the hospital almost every day, bringing stacks of paperwork, strategizing with Nick and Cam at my bedside. The plan started small: file a restraining order against Jackson, initiate a custody suit against Amanda. But Grace wasn't satisfied with small wins. She wanted to burn their empire to the ground. "We need evidence," Grace said one afternoon, pacing the room with a determined glint in her eye. "We need to prove that Jackson used his position to manipulate Amanda, that the attack on you was orchestrated to intimidate you into silence." Nick leaned forward, a hard look on his face. "We've got their DNA," he reminded her. "The piece of fabric David ripped off during the attack. It's not much, but it's something." Grace nodded, her eyes narrowing as she thought it through. "It's a start," she agreed. "And I know people who can help us dig deeper. Private investigators, forensic experts, whatever it takes. We're going to build a case so airtight they won't have anywhere to hide." There was a new energy in the room, a sense of purpose that felt almost electrifying. I could see it in Nick's clenched fists, in the determined set of Cam's jaw, and most of all, in the fire burning behind Grace's eyes. They had tried to break me, but all they'd done was give me a reason to fight harder. And now, I had an army of people ready to stand with me. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the one laying the trap, the one preparing to strike back. And this time, I was going to make sure they felt every ounce of the pain they'd inflicted on me. Grace wasted no time. She moved with a level of precision and intensity one hadn't seen before. Within days of agreeing to take on my case, she was filing lawsuits against Amanda, Jackson, and the entire advertising firm they worked for. This wasn't just a simple custody battle anymore, it was an all-out legal war. Grace hit them from every angle: charges of sexual harassment, coercion, and gross violations of ethical standards. The firm had tried to cover up Jackson's misconduct for years, and Grace was determined to expose every dirty secret they had hidden away. The office of the district attorney was flooded with paperwork. Grace's legal team had gathered statements from former employees, many of whom had left the firm quietly after experiencing harassment or witnessing unethical behavior. They had been silenced by non-disclosure agreements and threats of retaliation. But Grace knew how to crack the system. She found the loopholes, the technicalities that would allow these people to come forward without fear. Soon, we had a list of witnesses willing to testify against Jackson, people who had seen firsthand how he used his power to manipulate and intimidate. But Grace and I both knew that lawsuits alone wouldn't be enough to bring Jackson down. He was too well protected, too used to getting his way. We needed something more, a way to hit him where it hurt the most. That's when I decided to send him the DNA results. It wasn't just a bluff or a scare tactic. It was a calculated move, designed to destroy the carefully constructed facade of control Jackson had built around himself. I took the DNA results of the twins, the proof that neither of them was mine, and included a handwritten note. One of these children isn't even yours, Jackson. Say hello to Troy's kid. Troy had been Amanda's boss before she joined Jackson's firm. He was a charismatic executive, known for his charm and his ruthlessness in equal measure. Rumors about an affair between him and Amanda had circulated for years, but nothing had ever been confirmed. The implication that one of the twins might actually be Troy's child was enough to detonate like a bomb in Jackson's life. It was a direct hit to his ego, his reputation, and his sense of ownership over Amanda's betrayal. The fallout was immediate. Within days of receiving the envelope, Jackson's carefully maintained life began to unravel. He confronted Amanda in a fit of rage, demanding to know the truth. According to what I heard from our contacts at the firm, it was an explosive argument, one that could be heard through the walls of the executive offices. Jackson, always so composed and calculating, had finally lost control. He was shouting, accusing, throwing things. It was the kind of spectacle that left everyone in the office whispering, the kind of scandal that no amount of corporate PR could sweep under the rug. Meanwhile, Grace was already moving on her next play. She leaked just enough information to the press to start a media frenzy. Stories began circulating about the lawsuits, about the toxic culture of the advertising firm, and about the affair between Amanda and Jackson. Grace knew how to play the media like a violin, releasing just enough details to pique the public's interest without revealing everything. It was a strategic drip of information, designed to keep the pressure mounting day by day. And then, the real bombshell dropped, a new lawsuit filed against Jackson by one of his former assistants, alleging sexual misconduct and harassment spanning several years. The assistant had been too scared to speak out before, but with Grace's support and the growing wave of public outrage, she found the courage to come forward. The story made headlines. It wasn't just a corporate scandal anymore, it was a full-blown crisis. In just a few weeks, the empire Jackson had spent decades building started to crumble. Investors pulled out of major deals, fearing the negative publicity. The board of directors convened an emergency meeting, and Jackson was forced to step down as CEO temporarily, though everyone knew it was a permanent exit disguised to save face. His reputation, once spotless, was now in tatters, marred by allegations of abuse and misconduct. Amanda wasn't spared either. She lost her job almost immediately. The firm couldn't afford to keep her on, not when her name was splashed across the same headlines as Jackson's. She became a pariah in the industry, someone who couldn't be trusted, someone whose involvement in the scandal had made her untouchable. I watched it all unfold from a distance, a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness swirling inside me. I had set this chain of events in motion, and now it was all crashing down, just as I had planned. But instead of feeling victorious, I felt hollow, as if I'd won the battle but lost something far more important along the way. The aftermath of the scandal hit Amanda harder than anyone. Jackson, true to his self-serving nature, abandoned her the moment the truth came to light. He was a man who thrived on control and power, and the revelation that one of the twins wasn't even his was a humiliation he couldn't forgive. He severed ties with Amanda immediately, leaving her to face the consequences on her own. Overnight, Amanda went from being a respected attorney with a promising career to a disgraced figure nobody wanted to be associated with. The law firm fired her to salvage their own reputation. Her professional network evaporated, and her so-called friends, colleagues who used to flock around her at corporate events, were nowhere to be found. The legal battle for custody of the twins was swift and brutal. With the DNA evidence in play and Grace's relentless strategy, the court ruled in my favor. Amanda lost custody, deemed unfit due to her unstable situation and the web of lies she had spun. For the first time since I'd known her, Amanda was completely alone. In the weeks that followed, I heard rumors of her drifting from one temporary rental to another, looking more haggard each time someone spotted her. It was hard to imagine that this was the same woman who once walked into a room with such confidence, who commanded respect and admiration with every word she spoke. Now, she was a shadow of herself, weighed down by the fallout of her choices. Then, one afternoon, it happened. I was home, sitting in the living room with Amy, my new girlfriend. Amy was everything Amanda wasn't: genuine, kind, and uncomplicated. She had been my rock through the chaos of the last few months, offering support without hesitation. We were talking about weekend plans when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone, and when I opened the door, I almost didn't recognize the woman standing there. It was Amanda, but she looked nothing like the polished, self-assured lawyer I once knew. Her hair was unkempt, her clothes wrinkled and ill-fitting. Dark circles framed her eyes, eyes that now held a hollow, haunted look. She seemed smaller, as if the weight of everything that had happened had physically diminished her. "Amanda," I said, my voice betraying the shock I felt. I didn't know what to expect: a confrontation, maybe? Some last-ditch attempt to reclaim the life she'd lost? Instead, she just stood there, looking like she might collapse at any moment. "I didn't know where else to go," she whispered, her voice so quiet I could barely hear it. There was no anger, no defensiveness. Just raw, unfiltered desperation. It was a side of Amanda I had never seen before, and it threw me off balance. Before I could respond, Amy stepped forward. I saw the flash of emotion in her eyes, pity, mixed with the lingering bitterness she still held toward Amanda. Amy had every reason to hate her. She knew the whole story, knew how Amanda had betrayed me and tried to manipulate our family's future. Yet, despite everything, Amy did something that caught me by surprise. "Come in," Amy said, her voice calm but firm. She guided Amanda inside, helping her to a chair. I could tell that it wasn't easy for her, but she did it anyway. She handed Amanda a glass of water and sat across from her, waiting for her to speak. Amanda took a sip, her hands trembling. She looked up at me, tears welling up in her eyes. "David," she began, her voice breaking, "I don't know what to say. I've lost everything. I have no job, no friends, and I don't even know how to be a mother anymore." Hearing her say that should have filled me with satisfaction, vindication even. This was the woman who had shattered my trust, who had conspired with Jackson to destroy me. But instead, all I felt was a deep, aching sadness. I realized in that moment that I had already won. The real victory wasn't in watching Amanda's life fall apart, it was in knowing that I had moved past it. I had built something new with Amy, something real and honest, and I didn't need to cling to my anger anymore. I nodded slowly, taking a deep breath. "You made your choices, Amanda," I said quietly. "But you're still the mother of my children, and they deserve better. If you're willing to get your life together, I'll help you. Not for your sake, but for theirs." Amy squeezed my hand, a silent show of support. I could tell she wasn't thrilled about this, but she understood why I was doing it. It wasn't about forgiveness, it was about showing that I had moved beyond the pain, that I could offer Amanda a lifeline without falling back into the trap of resentment. Amanda broke down, sobbing into her hands. It was the first time I'd ever seen her cry like that, openly, without any hint of control or composure. It was as if the last of her defenses had crumbled, leaving her vulnerable and exposed. Amy stood up and placed a comforting hand on Amanda's shoulder. "You can stay here tonight," she said softly. "We'll figure out the rest in the morning." It was a small act of kindness, but it felt monumental. I knew that Amy didn't do it for Amanda's sake. She did it for me, to help me prove to myself that I could rise above the past, that I wasn't defined by the betrayal and the bitterness. In that moment, I realized I wasn't the man I used to be. The person standing here now, offering Amanda a chance to rebuild, was someone stronger, someone who had faced the darkness and come out on the other side. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. In the days that followed her unexpected visit, I made a decision that surprised even me. I was going to help Amanda get back on her feet. It wasn't an easy choice. Every fiber of my being still remembered the betrayal, the lies, the nights I spent reeling from the pain of what she'd done. But as much as I wanted to let her suffer the consequences, I couldn't ignore the fact that she was the mother of my children. If she continued down this path, it would only end up hurting the twins in the long run. And for their sake, I couldn't let that happen. I sat Amanda down at the kitchen table one morning, a pot of coffee between us. She looked fragile, exhausted, nothing like the woman I'd once known. I handed her a set of papers I had drawn up, a lease agreement for a small apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't anything fancy, but it was a place where she could start over. "This is yours," I said, sliding the papers across the table. "The first 6 months are paid for. After that, you're on your own. I've also set up a small account for you, enough to cover basic expenses until you find work." Amanda's eyes widened in surprise. She stared at the documents, then back at me, her expression a mixture of gratitude and confusion. "David, I don't know what to say," she stammered. "Why are you doing this? After everything I did to you, why would you help me?" I took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "Because this isn't about us anymore," I said quietly. "It's about the kids. They deserve to have both parents in their lives, and they deserve a mother who isn't living out of a suitcase, scraping by in desperation. If you're willing to make the effort, I'm giving you a chance to rebuild. But make no mistake, Amanda, this is the only chance you're going to get." She looked down at her hands, twisting the ring finger that once held her wedding band. For a moment, I saw a flicker of the old Amanda, the one I fell in love with, the confident, driven woman who could take on anything. But it was quickly replaced by a shadow of regret, the realization of everything she had lost. "I don't deserve this," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I know I don't." "You're right," I replied, my tone firm but not unkind. "You don't. But the kids do. And if there's any part of you that still cares about them, you'll take this opportunity and make the most of it. Not for me, but for them." Amanda nodded slowly, wiping away a tear that slipped down her cheek. "I will," she said, her voice barely audible. "I promise I will." I nodded, standing up to leave. "Good," I said simply. "Because if you don't, I won't be here to pick up the pieces next time." In the weeks that followed, I helped Amanda move into her new place. It was a small, one-bedroom apartment, but it was clean and safe, a far cry from the luxury she'd once been accustomed to. She didn't complain, didn't ask for anything more. It was as if she knew this was her chance to prove that she could still be a part of the twins' lives, even if it was on a much smaller scale than before. I visited occasionally, dropping off groceries or helping her set up the place. It was awkward at first, the silence between us filled with unspoken memories and lingering bitterness. But over time, I noticed a change in Amanda. She was quieter, more reflective. There was a humility about her now, a sense of someone who had been broken down to her core and was trying, however clumsily, to piece herself back together. One afternoon, I arrived with a box of toys for the twins. Amanda opened the door, and I noticed for the first time that she looked different. She had a tired but genuine smile on her face, and the apartment was tidy, with a few framed photos on the wall, pictures of the kids, ones I hadn't seen before. It wasn't much, but it felt like a home. "Thank you," she said, taking the box from my hands. "For everything. I know I don't have the right to ask for your help, but you've given it anyway." I shrugged, leaning against the doorframe. "I'm not doing it for you, Amanda," I reminded her. "I'm doing it for them. Just don't make me regret it." She nodded, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "I won't," she said. "I know I have a lot to make up for. I just hope I can be the mother they deserve." I looked at her then, really looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel anger or resentment. Instead, I felt a strange kind of pity. Amanda had fallen from grace in the most spectacular way, and now she was left to pick up the pieces of a life she'd shattered. But maybe, just maybe, there was still a chance for her to salvage something from the wreckage. "You've got a long way to go," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "But at least you're taking the first step. That's more than I thought you'd do." As I turned to leave, she called after me. "David," she said, her voice hesitant. I paused, glancing back at her. "Thank you," she said again, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "Not just for the help, but for giving me a chance to make things right." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod before walking away. I didn't do it for her gratitude. I did it because I needed to know that I could rise above what had happened. I needed to prove to myself that I could be the bigger person, that I had healed enough to offer help even to the one who had hurt me the most. As I drove away, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly. But it was a step in the right direction. And maybe, in some small way, that was enough. Life started to move forward in a way I hadn't thought possible. Amy and I found a new home, a modest but beautiful house nestled in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Austin. It wasn't the grand, historical home I once shared with Amanda, but it was exactly what we needed, a fresh start, free from the memories that had haunted me for so long. It was a place where we could build something new, something untainted by betrayal. The kids loved it too. The backyard was big enough for them to run around, and there was a tree perfect for hanging a swing. On weekends, we'd take them out to the park or have picnics by the lake. Amy was incredible with them, patient, loving, the kind of mother figure I had hoped Amanda would be. Watching her interact with the twins made me realize how lucky I was to have found someone like her. Someone who could step into this mess of a situation and still see a future worth fighting for. We settled into a routine, one that felt almost normal. On some days, it was easy to forget the chaos we'd been through. Amy and I would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset, talking about our plans for the future. We dreamed of taking the kids on road trips, of starting new traditions, of maybe even having a child of our own one day. But there was one part of me that couldn't move on so easily, a part that still burned with the need for closure. Despite the new life we were building, despite the joy I found with Amy and the kids, I couldn't shake the sense that my fight wasn't over. Jackson had gotten away with too much. He had tried to destroy my life, and even though I'd survived, I couldn't let him walk away unscathed. I couldn't allow him to think he'd won. I kept my thoughts to myself, of course. Amy knew me well enough to sense that something still lingered, but she never pushed me on it. She trusted that if it was something I needed to deal with, I'd handle it. And in a way, that trust only fueled my resolve. I didn't want Amy to be dragged back into the mess I was about to create. I wanted her to have the peace she deserved, to be free from the shadows of my past. But I wasn't done with Jackson, not by a long shot. I started tracking him quietly, using contacts I'd made over the years, friends in the tech industry who owed me favors. Jackson thought he had weathered the storm. He'd stepped down from his CEO position, but he was still operating in the background, pulling strings, making deals. He was clever, I'd give him that. He knew how to manipulate the narrative, how to present himself as the victim of a smear campaign orchestrated by disgruntled former employees. But I wasn't fooled. I knew the kind of man he was, and I knew he wouldn't be content with lying low for long. I kept tabs on him, his business meetings, his new investments, the people he was aligning himself with. I watched and waited, like a predator stalking its prey, biding my time for the perfect moment to strike. I didn't want just a petty act of revenge. I wanted to dismantle everything he had built, to expose him in a way that left no room for him to recover. It wasn't hard to find his weak spots. Jackson had always been arrogant, and that arrogance made him sloppy. He couldn't resist flaunting his connections, throwing lavish parties, and making shady backroom deals. Through a few well-placed phone calls and a little digital digging, I uncovered the cracks in his latest venture, a real estate project built on a foundation of bribes and illegal contracts. It was a house of cards, and I was ready to pull the first one out. But I held back. Timing was everything. I needed to make sure that when I struck, there would be no escape for him. No chance for him to spin the story or shift the blame. I'd seen what he was capable of, how easily he could manipulate people, twist the truth. I couldn't afford to rush this. Amy sensed that something was different. She'd catch me staring off into the distance sometimes, lost in thought. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, she took my hand in hers and squeezed it gently. "David," she said softly, "you don't have to keep fighting. We're happy now. You've already won." I looked at her, the woman who had become my anchor in a storm I thought would never end. I knew she was right, in a way. I had won. I had rebuilt my life, found love again, and created a home for the kids. But there was a part of me that needed this final act, that needed to see Jackson fall as far as he had tried to make me fall. "I know," I said, pulling her closer, kissing the top of her head. "But there's one more thing I have to do." Amy didn't ask for details. She just nodded, her face a mixture of understanding and sadness. "Just promise me," she said quietly, "that when it's over, you'll let it go." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I could keep that promise. I hoped that once Jackson was dealt with, the anger that still simmered inside me would finally burn out. Maybe then, I could close that chapter for good. In the meantime, I kept watching, waiting for the right moment. The kids played in the backyard, Amy hummed a tune in the kitchen, and I stood by the window, eyes fixed on the horizon. Life was good, but it wasn't finished yet. Not until I saw Jackson fall. It was a quiet night, the kind where the city seemed to hold its breath. The kids were asleep, their soft breathing filling the house with a sense of peace that I hadn't felt in a long time. Amy was curled up on the couch with a book, her feet tucked under her, lost in a story. From where I sat by the window, I could see the city skyline, a maze of lights stretching out into the distance, shimmering like 1,000 tiny stars. It was beautiful, in its own way. But it felt far away, distant, like it belonged to another world, a world I was no longer a part of. As I sat there, I found myself thinking about everything that had happened, everything I had lost and gained in the past few years. I'd fought so hard to get here, claw my way back from the edge of despair. I'd torn down the people who had betrayed me, exposed the lies, and won the battles I never wanted to fight. In the eyes of the world, I was victorious. I had my financial freedom, a new family with Amy, and the kids who brought joy to my life in ways I couldn't have imagined. But as I looked out at the city, I felt an emptiness I couldn't ignore. It was as if I were standing on top of a mountain I'd spent years climbing, only to find that the view wasn't what I expected. I had reached the summit, but the satisfaction I thought would be there was missing. The thrill of the fight was gone, and in its place was a hollow ache that refused to go away. I'd gotten my revenge. I'd watched as Jackson's life crumbled beneath him, as Amanda lost everything she had sacrificed me for. I'd seen the people who hurt me brought low, forced to face the consequences of their actions. But instead of feeling triumph, I felt nothing. Or worse, I felt regret. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass of the window, closing my eyes. Was it worth it? The question had been gnawing at me for weeks, but I had pushed it aside, telling myself that the answer was obvious. Of course it was worth it. I had stood up for myself, fought back against the people who tried to destroy me. I had done what anyone in my position would have done. But now, alone with my thoughts, I wasn't so sure. The victories I'd achieved had come at a cost I hadn't fully reckoned with until now. In my quest for justice, for retribution, I had become someone I didn't quite recognize. I had been consumed by my anger, driven by a need to even the score. And in doing so, I had lost something, some small, vital piece of myself that I couldn't get back. I thought about the nights I spent plotting my next move, the satisfaction I felt when I uncovered another piece of evidence, another way to strike back. I realized that those moments had become my purpose, my reason for getting out of bed each morning. It was easier to live for revenge than to face the pain of what had happened. But now that the fight was over, now that there was nothing left to plan for, I was left with the reality I'd been avoiding all along. The reality that revenge hadn't healed me. It had only masked the wound. Behind me, I heard Amy's soft footsteps. She came up behind me, wrapping her arms around my shoulders, resting her chin on top of my head. "You're lost in your thoughts again," she murmured, her voice filled with gentle concern. I reached up and took her hand, squeezing it lightly. "Yeah," I admitted. "Just thinking about everything." She didn't say anything, just held me, giving me the space to work through my emotions. Amy had a way of understanding what I needed, even when I couldn't put it into words. It was one of the things I loved most about her, her patience, her quiet strength. After a while, I turned to look at her, searching her eyes for something I couldn't quite name. "Do you think it was worth it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Amy's expression softened. She didn't answer right away, taking a moment to choose her words carefully. "I think," she said slowly, "that you did what you needed to do to survive. You went through something terrible, and you fought back the only way you knew how. But now, it's time to let go, David. You can't keep holding on to the anger. It's going to destroy you, if you let it." I nodded, swallowing hard. I knew she was right. The anger, the need for revenge, it had been my shield, my way of coping with the unbearable pain of betrayal. But it wasn't sustainable. It wasn't a way to live. If I kept holding on to it, it would consume me, just like it had consumed Amanda and Jackson. "Maybe I lost a part of myself in this fight," I said quietly, voicing the fear that had been lurking in the back of my mind. Amy cupped my face in her hands, forcing me to meet her gaze. "Maybe you did," she said softly. "But you can find yourself again. You're not the same person you were before, and that's okay. You've been through hell, and you came out on the other side. That's what matters." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I blinked them away, pulling her into a tight embrace. "Thank you," I whispered. "For believing in me, even when I couldn't believe in myself." She kissed my forehead, her lips warm and comforting. "I love you," she said simply. "And I'll be here, no matter what." I held her close, letting the silence wash over us. Maybe I hadn't found the peace I was looking for yet. Maybe it would take time, more time than I wanted to admit. But as I stood there with Amy, feeling the steady beat of her heart against mine, I realized that I had something more important than revenge. I had a chance at real happiness, at a future that wasn't defined by what had been done to me, but by what I chose to build.